was only 22 when this happened, young, eager to make money, and still trying to figure out where my life was going. I had just graduated from college and was in that strange in-between stage. Not unemployed exactly, but not on any real career path either. To get by, I filled my days with odd jobs around my small town. Babysitting for neighbors, cleaning houses, running errands for elderly couples, anything that paid cash and kept me busy. One afternoon, a woman I had dog sat for in the past called me up. She said a friend of her neighbor's was looking for someone trustworthy. His name was Craig. He needed someone to stay at his house for a week while he was out of town and look after his golden retriever, Max. She spoke highly of him, said he was polite, well-mannered, and seemed generous. Later that day, Craig himself called me. His voice was warm, even friendly, though something about it lingered in my mind, like he was a little too enthusiastic about speaking with me. He explained that Max was an anxious dog, not the kind who did well if someone just stopped by to feed him and leave. He wanted someone who would actually live in his house for the week, sleep there, keep Max company. The pay he offered was more than I usually got for pet sitting. It wasn't just good money, it was tempting. I told him yes. 2 days later, we met face to face. Craig was in his late 40s, tall, with wire-rimmed glasses and a neat windbreaker. At first glance, nothing about him struck me as threatening. Maybe a little overly friendly, he stood just a little too close when he spoke, held eye contact just a little too long but not creepy. His house was on the far edge of town, tucked back into a wooded area. It looked nice enough, though dated, with beige carpeting and floral curtains that looked like they hadn't been changed in a decade. Craig gave me the grand tour. He showed me where Max's food was, where the spare key was hidden, which items in the fridge I could use. He told me I'd be staying in the guest bedroom, just off the living room on the first floor. He even mentioned little details, like which lights he preferred to leave on at night. When I left that day, I remember thinking how easy the job seemed. The house was quiet, the dog was sweet, and the money was better than I expected. I felt lucky. That Monday, I officially started. The first night was uneventful. I watched television with Max curled up at my feet, took him on a short walk, and went to bed in the guest room. The second night passed just as peacefully. It wasn't until the third night that I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. On that third night, I was lying in bed with Max curled up near my feet, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog. That's when I noticed it. Across from me, on top of the dresser, sat a small digital alarm clock. At first, it seemed ordinary enough. Black plastic, bright blue LED numbers glowing in the dark. But the longer I stared at it, the more it struck me as wrong. The room had a kind of outdated charm to it. Beige carpet, an old lamp with a floral shade, curtains that belonged to the early 2002. And yet, this clock was sleek, modern, almost too new. Something about it nagged at me. I leaned forward, squinting. That's when I saw it. A tiny, perfectly round black pinhole above the numbers. At first, I thought it was a sensor, maybe for light adjustment or something. But then my stomach dropped. The angle of that hole, it was pointed directly at the bed. My breath caught in my throat. My hands went clammy. I had read stories about hidden cameras being disguised as alarm clocks, smoke detectors, even picture frames. But I'd never actually seen one. I reached over and picked it up. It was heavier than a normal clock, and when I held it close, I swore I could hear a faint buzzing sound, like a tiny fan working inside. I turned it over in my hands, staring right into the little black lens. And that's when Max lifted his head suddenly, ears perked, a low whine in his throat. From somewhere else in the house deep inside, not near the front door, I heard it. The sound of a door closing. Every hair on my body stood on end. Craig wasn't supposed to be back until Sunday. It was only Wednesday. I froze, clutching the clock, my heart hammering so hard it almost hurt. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps moving down the hallway carpet. Panic surged through me. I quickly set the clock back on the dresser, hurried to the bedroom door, and locked it just as the footsteps stopped outside. Then came his voice. "Hey," Craig said, calm but slightly out of breath. I left something in there last time I was home. I need to grab it real quick. Can you open the door?" I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it had closed. A beat of silence. Then he spoke again, this time with a rehearsed explanation. "It's not what you think," he said. "That's not a camera, it's a motion sensor. For the dog." I didn't want to freak you out by mentioning it. His tone was steady, but there was something underneath it. A sharp edge, a hint of impatience. I backed away from the door, my hand covering my mouth, while Craig knocked again, softer at first, then harder. "Come on, don't make this weird," he said. "Let's just talk like adults." When I still didn't answer, the knocking turned to pounding. His voice sharpened, cracked with anger. "Open the damn door." Max began barking wildly, throwing himself against the door as if trying to push Craig back. The pounding grew louder, heavier, almost shaking the frame. I glanced at the window. It was low enough to climb out, but locked. My hand shook so violently it took me 3 tries to unfasten the latch. Behind me, Craig was still pounding, his voice now rising in fury. "If you don't open this door, I'll get the key, and I'll call the cops. Tell them you broke into my house." My pulse roared in my ears. I shoved the window open, hoisted myself up, and tumbled out into the night. I hit the grass hard, scraping my knees, but I didn't care. I ran. The night air was cold against my face as I stumbled into the yard, my legs pumping with blind panic. Behind me, Max barked frantically from inside the room, his claws scratching against the wood, the sound echoing into the night. I wanted so badly for him to leap out after me, but he didn't. His barking faded as I sprinted through the side yard and down the long gravel driveway. My phone was in my pocket, but my hands were shaking too much to pull it out. Every crunch of gravel beneath my shoes made me think Craig was right behind me, chasing me through the dark. My heart thundered as I reached the road at last, collapsing near a cluster of mailboxes. I crouched behind them, crouched low, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see his figure emerge from the shadows. Finally, with trembling fingers, I managed to call my mom. My voice cracked as I begged her to come pick me up immediately. She lived about 15 minutes away, but in that moment, it felt like an eternity. I crouched there, hyperventilating, staring at the bend in the road where her headlights would eventually appear. Every sound of the night made me flinch. The rustle of leaves, the chirp of a cricket, even the wind through the trees. They all seemed sinister, amplified by the terror still rushing through my body. At last, twin beams of light cut through the darkness. My mom's car slowed, and the passenger door flew open. I didn't wait for her to ask questions. I just bolted to the car, slammed the door shut, and whispered for her to drive. The whole ride home, she kept glancing at me, asking what happened, but I couldn't form the words. Not yet. My mind was still back at that house, picturing Craig's face just outside the door, imagining him standing there in the dark with that fake, calm voice. I didn't relax until we pulled into her driveway and locked the doors behind us. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of that door shutting somewhere inside Craig's house. And worse, I couldn't stop thinking about one terrifying possibility. If the camera was real, if Craig really had been watching me, then maybe, just maybe, he had already been in the house all along, watching me, waiting. The next morning, exhaustion clung to me like a heavy blanket. My mom made coffee, sat me down at the kitchen table, and finally pressed me to explain everything. My voice shook as I told her about the clock, the pinhole camera, the footsteps, Craig's sudden return, and how I jumped out the window to get away. She just stared at me, her hand frozen around her coffee mug. "We're calling someone," she said firmly. "A lawyer, the police, somebody." By noon, I was sitting in a quiet office, explaining the entire story again, this time to a lawyer. I wanted to believe he would nod, agree that what Craig did was criminal, and tell me justice would be swift. Instead, his face tightened with something like pity. He explained that unless I had physical proof or recording from the camera, the device itself, or at least photographs pressing charges, would be difficult. Even if the clock contained a hidden camera, Craig could easily claim it was just a harmless motion sensor. Without evidence, it was my word against his. My stomach sank. I thought about going back to the house, sneaking in, and taking pictures of the clock. But just the thought of Craig's face, the sound of his pounding on that door, made my skin crawl. My lawyer warned me against it, too, he said. Going back there alone was too dangerous. So I didn't. Nothing happened to Craig. No arrest, No investigation, just silence. And I never got paid for those 3 nights I stayed there. The woman who had recommended me to him stopped responding to my messages completely. I don't know if she knew more than she let on, but her sudden silence felt like another betrayal. In the weeks that followed, the fear didn't go away. It stayed with me, haunting the corners of my daily life. I started checking every clock in my apartment, every smoke detector, every picture frame. I couldn't walk into a room without scanning it for lenses. At night, my dreams replayed that moment, the sound of the door closing somewhere behind me in a house I thought was empty. In those nightmares, I always turned around, and Craig was standing there. By the time September rolled around, I thought I had finally shaken off the worst of it. The paranoia, the constant checking, the nightmares they had dulled, though never fully disappeared. I told myself it was over. Craig was in the past, just a bad memory. That's when my girlfriend Emma and I planned a short trip to visit her sister, who lived about 3 hours away. To save money, I booked an Airbnb instead of a hotel. On the website, the house looked perfect. An old 2-story place with a wraparound porch, warm yellow lighting glowing in the windows, hardwood floors that gave it a storybook charm. The reviews were good, the price was cheap, and it was only a short drive from her sister's home. The listing mentioned one small detail I didn't think much about at the time. The basement storage room was off limits. I had seen that before in rentals owners keeping personal belongings locked away, so I brushed it off without a second thought. But when we pulled into the gravel driveway just before sunset, something about the place felt different. The paint on the siding looked more weathered than in the pictures. The house stood alone, surrounded by thick tree lines, with only one other home visible far in the distance. The road leading in was narrow and eerily quiet. And then there was the host. Alan was already waiting on the porch before we even got out of the car. He was tall, but slightly hunched, maybe in his late 50s, with thin gray hair combed neatly across his head. His flannel shirt was tucked too carefully into his jeans, like he was dressed to impress. He smiled at us, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. There was something rehearsed about it, something that felt off. When he shook our hands, his grip lingered just a beat too long, and when he showed us around the house, his voice was friendly enough, but beneath it was a subtle firmness, like he was reminding us we were guests in his space, not really welcome. The tour was short, a hallway that smelled faintly of dust and candle wax, though no candles were in sight. A cozy living room with an old television, a dated but clean kitchen, a single bedroom upstairs with a large bed and a ceiling fan spinning lazily above. But when we came back downstairs, Alan stopped at a door near the kitchen. Hanging from it was a heavy padlock. He tapped it with one finger. "This stays locked," he said, his tone suddenly firmer. "Storage space. Nothing down there you need." This time, he didn't smile. He just stared at us until we nodded. Then, as if satisfied, he moved on to show us where the towels were in the bathroom. A few minutes later, he wished us a pleasant stay and left through the front door, disappearing into the night. Emma and I unpacked, made some tea, and sat out on the porch for a while. The quiet pressed in from the trees, heavier than we were used to. No traffic, no distant neighbors, just silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. By the time we went to bed, the silence was so complete it felt suffocating, and sometime after midnight, I heard it the faintest sound from below, a dull thud. I froze when I heard it, a muffled thud from somewhere beneath us, sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the night. My first thought was the house settling. Old homes creak, wood shifts, pipes knock. I told myself that over and over, but the sound hadn't been a creak. It was heavier, deliberate. I held my breath and listened. Nothing, just silence again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself to let it go. I crawled back under the blanket, wrapped an arm around Emma, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next day was normal. Breakfast in town, a little shopping, lunch with Emma's sister. By the time we returned to the Airbnb, the unease from the night before had faded. We cooked dinner, laughed over a bottle of wine, and watched a movie until our eyelids grew heavy. But sometime around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly. The air in the room felt different, thicker, heavier. I sat up slowly, and that's when I heard it again. Not a thud this time, A dragging sound. It was faint, but unmistakable, like something heavy being pulled across a concrete floor. The sound stretched for a few seconds, stopped, then started again. My stomach tightened. It was coming from the basement. I told myself maybe Alan had returned for something, though he'd been very clear he wouldn't be around during our stay. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I crept out of bed, padding toward the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. Halfway down the stairs, I froze. The noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. From the bedroom, Emma's voice came in a hoarse whisper. "You hear that too, don't you?" I stepped back into the room, heart pounding, and nodded. We lay awake for nearly half an hour, waiting, listening, but the dragging never came again. The second night, however, was worse. Exhausted from a long hike, we fell into bed early, but around 2:30 a.m., the noises returned. This time, footsteps, 4 or 5 slow steps, a pause, 3 more, another pause. The pauses were long enough to feel intentional, as though whoever, or whatever it was down there, was listening. Emma gripped my hands, her nails digging into my skin. "I think I hear breathing," she whispered. I wanted to tell her she was imagining it, that it was just our nerves. But I heard it too, a faint, raspy exhale floating up from beneath the floor. We lay there in paralyzed silence until dawn, eyes wide, hearts racing. By the third morning, the house itself felt different, heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, and I knew I had to see the basement door. By the third morning, I couldn't take it anymore. The dread that seeped into every corner of the house was unbearable. Emma barely spoke during breakfast. Her spoon clinked against the bowl, her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine. The silence between us was louder than the crickets outside at night. When she stepped into the shower, I walked quietly to the kitchen and stood in front of the locked basement door. The padlock hung heavy against the wood, the metal cool when I touched it. It hadn't moved, at least not from what I could tell, but something felt different. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the wood. For a moment, all I heard was my own pulse rushing in my ears. Then, something faint, not footsteps this time, not dragging, just air. The faintest sound of stale, damp air seeping through the cracks. And the smell, at first it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the longer I stayed there, the clearer it became. A sour, unpleasant odor, like old water mixed with something rotten. My stomach churned. I jerked back as Emma's footsteps came down the hall. She stopped when she saw me standing there. "Why are you staring at that door?" she asked, her voice tight, as if she already knew the answer. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. We both felt it, the wrongness that radiated from the other side of that locked door. That night, the house wasted no time. Around midnight, the noises began again. First, metallic clinking, a sharp rhythmic tapping, like metal hitting stone. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, pausing, as though someone was deliberately pacing, waiting for us to notice. Emma refused to speak to me before bed. She sat stiffly, brushing her hair in silence, until she suddenly froze. "Does that smoke detector look strange to you?" she asked. I followed her gaze upward. At first, it looked normal, just a plastic white disc on the ceiling. But as I squinted, a chill crawled down my spine. There, in the center, was a small, perfectly round black dot, shinier than the surrounding plastic. I climbed onto the bed for a closer look. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a dot. It was a lens. The sight of that tiny black lens staring down at us made my skin crawl. I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and twisted the smoke detector until it popped loose from the ceiling. Inside, instead of wires and a battery, I found something far more chilling. A small battery-operated camera, its green light blinking faintly in the dark. Emma sat frozen on the bed, her brush slipping from her hand. Her face had gone pale, her breathing shallow, as though the very air in the room had been poisoned. I ripped the device down and set it on the dresser, my hands shaking violently. But some instinct told me to look again, to keep searching. That's when I saw it. A pinhole, no bigger than a pea, drilled into the wall just above the dresser mirror. From it protruded the faintest outline of another tiny lens, angled perfectly toward the bed. My stomach turned to ice. I began tearing through the room like a madman, yanking at picture frames, peering into vents, checking every dark corner. Emma just sat there, paralyzed, her eyes locked on the little camera, as though it might suddenly spring to life. 2 cameras, at least. Both aimed directly at the place where we slept, where we changed, where we thought we were safe. That was the breaking point. We shoved our belongings into our bags without folding a single thing. The zippers scraped loud in the silence, every sound making us flinch. I didn't care if Alan was waiting outside. I didn't care about politeness, or refunds, or the rules of Airbnb. All I knew was that we needed to get out. Minutes later, we were in the car, the gravel crunching under the tires as we sped away. Only when the house was swallowed by the trees behind us did Emma finally speak. "Call the police," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but it was steady with something fierce terror laced with anger. So we did. We pulled into the nearest gas station, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights, and dialed 911. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. We told them everything, the noises, the basement, the padlock, the cameras. They followed us back to the house. The front door was unlocked. The officers entered first, their flashlights sweeping across the walls, while Emma and I stood frozen on the porch. Within minutes, they had seized the smoke detector and the hidden lens, bagging them as evidence. But then we showed them the basement door. The padlock was gone. The door stood wide open, and the air drifting up from the darkness below smelled of rot. When the officers saw the open basement door, their expression shifted. Instantly gone was the casual professionalism, replaced by tight jaws and sharp eyes. One of them motioned for us to stay back as they stepped cautiously down the creaking stairs, beams of their flashlights cutting through the thick black. Emma gripped my arm so tightly it hurt. The smell was stronger now, drifting up like a foul exhale. Damp concrete, mildew, and something sour that made the back of my throat burn. At first, all we heard were the officers' boots on the steps, then their voices echoing faintly below. But within seconds, the tone of those voices changed, raised, urgent, commanding. One barked something we couldn't make out, followed by a sound of scuffling, as if furniture or someone was being dragged across the floor. Emma and I exchanged a terrified glance. Moments later, one officer shouted up the stairs, "We've got him!" And then we saw Alan, the host who had smiled too perfectly, who had tapped that padlock with such authority. He was pulled up from the basement in handcuffs, his hunched frame now trembling, his flannel shirt damp with sweat. His face, twisted under the harsh beam of the flashlight, was no longer welcoming. It was a mask of something feral, caught. The officers told us he had been hiding in a closet below. Inside that closet, they found a small monitor, wires snaking from it, blinking lights still alive. My stomach churned when I realized what it meant. The cameras in our room were likely feeding directly to him. He hadn't just planted them. He had been watching us in real time. The officers hauled Alan outside. Their voices clipped as they read him his rights. He didn't resist. He just stared at us with a strange, empty expression, as if he wasn't ashamed, wasn't afraid, just annoyed that we had caught on. Emma buried her face in my shoulder, shaking. I couldn't look away from him, because in that moment, one thought froze my blood more than anything else. If we hadn't discovered the cameras that night, would he have stayed hidden in that basement, watching us until we left? Or would he eventually have come upstairs? Alan was taken away that night, shoved into the back of a patrol car under the blinding flash of red and blue lights. Emma and I stood by silently, hollow and exhausted, as if every ounce of energy had been wrung from us. The officers asked us for detailed statements, writing down every sound we'd heard, every strange thing we'd noticed since the moment we arrived. They seized the cameras, the monitor, even the padlock. They promised to submit everything as evidence. We didn't have to testify in court. They said our written statements would be enough. Alan was later charged with criminal trespass and invasion of privacy. On paper, justice was served, but it didn't feel that way. Airbnb reached out soon after, offering us a voucher as if a few free nights in another stranger's house would erase what had happened. We accepted it, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Because the truth is, the experience never really ended. Emma hasn't been the same since. At night, She startles awake at the slightest creak of the apartment walls, clutching my arm, whispering, "Do you hear that?" I find myself scanning every room we enter, hotel ceilings, bathroom vents, even the glow of digital alarm clocks for the glint of a hidden lens. Trust is gone. The idea of a cozy rental in the woods, once charming, now fills me with unease. We stick to hotels these days, places with staff and security cameras in the lobby, places where at least the threat feels less personal. But sometimes, late at night, when the room is dark and quiet, I close my eyes and see Alan's face again, that too wide smile on the porch. His voice, rehearsed and practiced, showing us around a house he never really intended to leave. And worse, I hear the sounds, the metallic clinking, the footsteps in the basement, the dragging. I can't shake the thought that those noises weren't meant to scare us. They were rehearsals. And if we hadn't found those cameras in time, if we hadn't left that night, maybe Alan wouldn't have been content to just watch us from the shadows. Maybe one night, he would have finally climbed the stairs